everyone, welcome to our Bird Technology Series webinar. Today we have our part 2 of our 3 parts of human movement biomechanics for rehabilitation specialists. Today we'll be focusing in Newton's second law with Dr. James Donati. Dr. James Donati, he was here with us before for the first part. He'll be here for the third part too. Dr. Donati is an associate professor at the Ohio State University in the College of Medicine. And I'd like to thank you so much to be here. Couple things before we start the presentation. I want to tell everyone that you should post your questions on our chat. Don't wait to post your questions because Dr. Donati can go and answer your questions on the chat while the presentation is going. At the end, I'll talk to you guys a little bit more about future webinars and everything else. But for now, let's go to our presentation.
So welcome to Bird Tech Series, Human Movement Biomechanics for Rehabilitation Specialists. This is part 2 of a 3-part series, and this is focused on Newton's second law of motion. So let's just think about the basics of biomechanics. And we have a complicated bicycle here with a lot of different angles and so on and so forth. And the general concept is always that bio meaning life and mechanics meaning motion. So keep that as the framework for all of our Newton laws that we have that we're going to discuss as we come forward. So this is a nice complicated type of thing. So we have Sir Isaac Newton there in the center, and we have his different laws, and the first law of inertia was presented previously, and the third law will be going in. This one's going to be focused on Newton's second law. And so Newton's second law, which is the law of acceleration. And again, we have some different parts on this thing, but essentially thinking about more force means more acceleration, or more mass means less acceleration. So how do we utilize that clinically? That's going to be the basics of what we're going to discuss today and chat about. So remember, the basic premise of all movement always is going to come down to thinking about position and how we're going to define position statements. So here we have a nice little picture of some fish and one trying to get to another spot. So the basics of these things is how do we look at position information and how that defines our movement patterns. And so always remember that the basics of movement is always going to be position specific. So let's just dive deep into Newton's second law and the basic application of this as we move forward. So Newton's second law, the acceleration of an object depends on the mass of the object and the amount of force applied. So we have a couple of different components to be able to work with here. So the general idea is we always call this the force equals mass times acceleration law. And we typically are trying to influence one of these pieces to get something else to change. And again, this is going to happen from a sport performance world, from a rehabilitation specialist world, from an engineering world. And so everybody's going to have a different lens as they're kind of going through this. But the basic concept is always the same. So let's just think about the force aspect. So we have 2 very big collegiate football players here from 2 fine institutions. And the force of this movement will depend on a variety of different factors. But mass and acceleration are going to be involved in this force outcome. Now, factors that influence this, we always think about leverage, and you can think about the general concept of low man wins in football. Well, that is a concept here, and it can be applied in the force equals mass times acceleration concept. Let's just think about footwear in this piece, and we're going to concentrate on some of the forces at the feet for our presentation here in our discussion. But think about what's going on here. Eye level, pad level, trunk angle, hip angle, all go into this idea of force in this example. Now let's think about mass. This is a very massive individual. This individual's above 300 pounds. And this was a defensive tackle who took a fumble into the end zone from 50 yards away. And it's not a normal piece. His mass allows him to be able to do the things that he does on the defensive tackle side. So it doesn't allow him to accelerate very well. But for him to be able to move, and he scored this touchdown with some faster people behind him, he was able to generate a large amount of force, and it is happening every step that he takes. And we have to think about those things from an injury standpoint, a rehabilitation standpoint, a performance standpoint. What is the impact of that mass and acceleration demands and the force that is being applied on this individual? And then we have acceleration pieces, and this is a very fast running back. The idea of acceleration, moving fast. It'd be great to be able to put all those things together, and that's kind of the ideal from a performance standpoint. But from a rehabilitation standpoint, it's not any different. We want to be able to have our individuals be able to move fast. Remember, acceleration is a derivative of velocity, and velocity is a derivative of position. So it all relates back to position and time. So let's just think about this little piece here. So this is a bullet in slow motion and captured in a very slow motion fashion. And you can see that it has very little danger until we put in something that makes it move very, very fast. So if I were to just take this bullet and throw it, it would have no issue. So a very, very small object with low acceleration would not create a lot of force. So small, low mass, low acceleration, and I just threw it at you, it would have no problem you catching it, just laughing it off and coming back. But what we do is we put it in these types of things and we create high accelerations. So now this small mass with an extremely high acceleration creates a lot of force and a lot of damage. And it's a nice, easy thing to think about when we're thinking about force equals mass times acceleration. So in that force equals mass times acceleration, Newton's second law, we have to think of how it's going to apply and work with the other aspects of Newton's law. So inertia, remember, being able to move or not move an object that is moving or not moving. And then we'll get into action reaction at another time. But the understanding of force equals mass times acceleration basics is going to drive our clinical approaches to these things. So here's some pictures of different force, mass, and acceleration in individuals. In the upper left, we get to move a football. In the middle, we're doing a side rotation flip. We are balancing and jumping. We are running and cutting. We're kicking a soccer ball. All those things have influences on each other from a force, mass, and acceleration. So think about the run out for a run and cut. How much deceleration room do we have? In reality, deceleration is still acceleration, just in a negative fashion. How much room we have to decelerate out will determine how much acceleration we're going to put in. If we have a very short run out window, we're going to have a very short time to be able to slow down. So we change our acceleration patterns. If we have high forces into the ground to be able to create propulsion, well, then we still have to be able to control our mass and acceleration in space. So a very simple idea, and we're thinking about the ground on up here, and we see center pressure Z and center pressure X, and we see our different forces here and our torques, is understanding whenever we're standing, walking, running, moving, jogging, whatever it is, that we have force components, mass components, and acceleration components. And those drive our demands and our constraints of how we are going to move. So ground reaction force is one force that we can look at. And right now we're just looking at one of those forces, a vertical ground reaction force. And there's different ways to measure this and different ways and ideas. But the whole concept is that we are getting force put into the ground and our mass and our acceleration are helping determine how much force we're putting into that ground. And it's different at each portion of our stance phase. And then how much force is coming back. Think about running in sand. It's very difficult. Why? Well, it's related to not only Newton's second law, but also Newton's third law. We'll save that for the next time. But Newton's second law of force equals mass times acceleration, being able to go put that into the ground. And then what are we doing in getting forces back? So let's just think about this in a very simple clinical fashion. And I know that some people look at this going, okay, it's not a patient. Well, in my opinion, all these individuals moving are in a clinical fashion. So this is an NFL combine and they're doing a cone drill. And let's just really narrow and focus in on a couple of different factors relative to force equals mass times acceleration. Just looking at the thighs of this individual, probably not a small person, okay? And we know that we're putting force into the ground to be able to create a turn or a cut around a cone. Think of how much force is being applied in this very small area of the first toe with potentially second, third, fourth, fifth in there involved, and how that's generating forces all the way up and having to be able to control those pieces. And remember, we are trying to do this as fast as possible in their time. They're trying to demonstrate their prowess. And if we don't consider turf, cleats, stability up distal to the chain, proximal to the chain, those are all still dependent on Newton's second law of force equals mass times acceleration and how we are manipulating those pieces. Mass isn't going to really change much in this situation. So our acceleration will dictate our force and vice versa. So let's think about this now into a clinical fashion. So this is just one of the articles, and there's many articles on these things, but this is a change of direction assessment following anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction. And it's just a review of current practices. And they put out a idea of doing different types of runs. So shuffling, backwards run, forwards run, and changing directions. Well, one of the things is I think you can get fancy. You can have some different spaces and do those types of things. But I also think we can look at what we already use in a fitness world / sport performance world. And this is NFL pieces right here, and these are available online, you can see. So this is called the Pro Shuttle or the Pro Agility or the 5-10-5. And really it's a change of direction. And it's a very simple movement of changing the direction, but it's really a complex movement from a biomechanical perspective and thinking about controlling our force, mass, and acceleration aspects for looking at performance. So here we have a nice breakdown of individuals. These are different American football positions. So cornerback is a defensive individual. They have to be typically lighter and move and change direction a lot. An inside linebacker is usually a little bit bigger, but they have to do both. They have to be strong and be able to move. And then we'll go down to the defensive ends who have to be able to come around corners and pivot, and defensive tackles who need to be strong and hold there. The nice thing about this from a clinical standpoint, though, is we have measures of what's normal, what's a outstanding, and what are red flags. And so I think clinicians in a rehabilitation world, it'd be great to have these numbers, not only in a clinical perspective, which I think is in the safer environments, but also in the return to sport perspective. So really when we start doing some basic, simple single leg hops and triple hops, and we have those normative values, also matching them up to some of our sport performance values. And they all go back to, in my opinion, in this situation, three basic laws: Newton's first law, second law, and third law. And right now we're just discussing the force equals mass times acceleration. So the biggest wow for me in looking at some of these individuals, how big they are, mass, and how fast they move. The acceleration component, and they're able to generate high amounts of force under control. That makes the elite athlete in a lot of situations. So again, here's another one. It's the 3-cone drill, just a different direction. And it just gives you some different numbers and looking at some different parts. And I just want to put those thoughts into your head of always thinking about the force equals mass times acceleration, and always thinking about how those things are related into movement, not only in the rehabilitation realm, but in this bridge to performance realm, and thinking about those ideas. And I really love the concept of red flags. They're really kind of outside of the norm. And so we think about creating a norm, and then we have red flags who are outside of the norm, extremely slow for that. Or we also look at delta scores or change scores, the individual when they weren't injured versus the individual when they were injured. So we call that typically asymmetries. But I really like to think about the delta score and how much they have changed prior to injury versus post-injury. And then the elites. Everybody wants to look at the elites. How fast? What's the fastest person, and all those types of things. I think the ends of the spectrum are interesting, and also the middle of the spectrum is interesting. And everything has a relationship to the force equals mass times acceleration concept and Newton's other two laws. So again, just to reiterate, these are the basic foundations of not only rehabilitation, but all movement. This is a big individual who's moving and has high demands over a small area, and being able to do that not only quickly and powerfully, but also in front of people, and being able to do that with different demands on that. That's, to me, is some of the amazing things that some of these athletes and individuals can do. So again, I think we wrap this up by, standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's Sir Isaac Newton, and just a very simple concept that applies to all our movements in general. And hopefully you gathered a little bit of information from this, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's always nice to have you here. I like, because it's really useful and direct to the point, the way I like it. Right. If anyone have any questions, please feel free to put your questions on our chat. Dr. Renati will be here and answering your questions. While wait for your guys' questions, I have some questions myself. So so let's go over that. So how do we get starting on looking at norms for single leg hop for rehab?
So it's a great question. We have normative information clinically for those individuals from an asymmetry standpoint, right? So we know 5%, 10%, 15%, so on and so forth. What we don't have a lot of is what is the normative out there for different age groups or type of athletes, or so on and so forth. We've been collecting that data for a little while in our research lab, and different sports and different age groups and so on and so forth. So it gives me a general sense, but I always like to think of it as some of our other normative numbers that we know, right? So, if you say 120/80 on the blood pressure, you start thinking, okay, that's normal. If you just come out and say, my blood pressure is 2, that doesn't make sense. So we need numbers that somewhat give us make sense of these things. And speaking that language and understanding what goes into it, I think, is what makes the clinicians and the researchers understand each other better, so that the patient has better care. So that's the way I kind of think about it for the single leg hop is, what's our language, and what's our, in different countries, different speed limits, right? Some of us have to convert miles per hour to kilometers, and so on and so forth. When somebody says they were going 200 in the car, well, it depends. Are we in Europe or are we in the United States? Because if we're in the United States, that's going really, really, really fast because of the miles per hour. So I think in the single leg hop, things are, where's our naming system? Where's our natural numbering system that we know and we can start talking about? Same thing if you say, okay, well, I was able to jump 2 times my body height. Okay, great. But add that I also weigh 300 pounds. Now that's really impressive.
Yeah.
so you start adding your mass component to make sense of your force component, to make sense of your acceleration components. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at from a clinician standpoint.
Get it. I agree. So we have one question here from Dominic. Dominic is saying greetings. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. So his question is related. Is it related to Newton's second law, the fact that a bigger mass makes less effort than VO2 max when working in a cycle ergometer?
That's a good question. Thanks, Dominic. I haven't done a lot of work within the VO2 max systems or cycle ergometers or any bicycle, or for that matter. I would say that you would still have to be able to, usually if you have larger mass, you have larger mass to move from a lower extremity standpoint also. So, mass is usually proportional. So I would assume that you would still have to be able to kind of generate that, but I'm just not too familiar within the VO2 max part of that and the cycle ergometer part.
Okay, that's good. And what are the various aspects of Newton's second law of motion that can be used during daily clinical practice?
So I really think of just any exercise that you have, I think clinicians can really modify pending how much demand they want to put on the individual, right? So if we want to create more force, one of the things that we normally think about is adding mass. So now we add weights to something, so squats, and we put weights on our backs, or we do kettlebells or any of those types of things. We should also consider the acceleration components to that. So we don't have to actually add mass to have a greater force component. We could ask for a higher acceleration demand, or we could match those two things. We could go up in some slight mass and then add more acceleration or less acceleration components. Or really, I think one of the biggest things as clinicians that we really need to be training more of is the deceleration component. So I'm an ACL, knee, lower extremity type of person. Minus the cycle ergometer side. And I really think we don't train enough in rehabilitation settings, especially the deceleration demands. And those are really going to be related to Newton's second law and third law and first law. So
okay, we have one more question here from Terry.
Yeah, so, Terry.
With consideration,
I'll read this one, Fernando.
Okay, go ahead.
So Terry's asking about the dominance and especially competitive to a single sport. So I like to think of, a lot of times people like to think of dominance in some of these, hand dominance for basketball or baseball, or leg dominance for kicking for soccer. And usually you have one side that's a little bit better than the other. But yeah, I don't believe that we tried to achieve symmetry as a society in rehabilitation. I'm not quite sure that that's the goal. And I think Terry's kind of alluding to that. I think we have natural asymmetries that occur and give us the ability to be able to perform something at a high level, right? And yes, you have some people who are equal both hands or equal both feet. But, I think our adaptations are to be able to provide an advantage. So I definitely have one side that is more controlling and stabilizing, and one side that is more moving and acceleration and coordination from that component. So I don't believe in the symmetry is our end goal. I believe coordinative structures may not look the same when you just look at symmetry or asymmetries. So if that helps you, Terry, I think that's kind of where you're going on your question about symmetry and can we achieve symmetry in single sport. Is that actually our goal?
I'll tell you one phrase that I heard on my PT school once was function over symmetry.
I agree. I mean, so we evaluated over. So one of my projects that we did with many great people, we found that non-injured high school individuals in the United States, we did nearly 6,000 individuals, and some repeated, over years, over their high school careers. Symmetry is very unusual. Asymmetry is normal.
Yep.
So,
Yep. So we have Charlie there. Do you want to go over and read the questions? Or
yeah, I'll read it. Charlie has one on, is force transferred upon contact, like with Newton's balls? Does mass have an effect on that? Well, I mean, mass definitely has an effect on what it's going to do within the acceleration component. But if mass is kept standard, right? And again, it's a little bit difficult to think about that in a non-vacuum world, right? So we have gravity that's kind of involved in our world here. But if we were to control it and working in a vacuum, and mass were to be stable the entire time and symmetrical across the entire, location, which the human body is not that way, right? I mean, we look at mass as just a large structure, and we're putting us into one unit. But the reality is my arms are different, my torso is different, my legs are different in the components and what we're trying to do. So I think that's, I mean, again, in the ideal world, in a vacuum, yeah, those things kind of work, but we don't work in a vacuum. So we have to think about, again, not only mass, moment arms, so on and so forth into our movement patterns.
all the drags and frictions and everything else that goes there, they're staying away so many times.
Yeah, the basics of what we do, right? And this is the whole reason for this series, is for us to not get caught up in all the technological advancements that we have and all the really, great outputs that we can have, and forget the basics. And this idea is not only the basics for students, but it's the basics for experienced clinicians, for experienced researchers, for just, the most expert of experts always have to think back to, the simplest and the most basic components will still drive all of our, technological advances.
And a segue for that, which is your favorite Newton's law?
The next one coming up, Newton's third law is my favorite Newton's law. So for me, I'm a big Newton's third law part, but I like them. I mean, I like them all. I like constantly quizzing high school students and college students and asking them that same question. For me, it's just, it's a constant basis of watching movements and saying, oh, what if we influence this or influence that? And how do we do this and how we do that? That's why I have a PhD in human movement science. This has just been very interesting for me for years. And I don't just study ACL, I study everything from the foot to the spine to the concussions and everything in between, because I'm just interested in movement. So for me, Newton's laws, that would be one of the things, if I could time travel, I would like to meet. And I'd probably be crushed because, it wasn't probably his idea. There was many people's ideas, things of that nature.
So how did Newton's ideas concerning motion become law?
I don't know that. I don't know that answer. Do you know that answer?
No.
I mean, obviously many repetitive, hopefully many repetitive things. I'm gonna have to look that up. I was thinking that when I was just talking, I was like, the hardest thing is to have something become a law. How does that actually occur? I don't know how a scientific fact, hopefully somebody on this call does. How does a scientific piece become a law? I gotta get my lab students on that one.
So we can create a law ourselves, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm not gonna name it after myself, so I can.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. So Newtonian biomechanics deals with a singular aspect of movement control. What are the other parameters of movement that must be considered?
Well, I mean, you have so many different factors that are involved in movement, right? So, you get the Newtonian mechanics and that kind of spherical aspect of things. You have a whole neurophysiological side of things, right? And I kind of combine those two pieces, but really they should be separated out on those aspects. So, I mean, the reality is we like to try to break down human and animal movement into these boxes, right? So we have our physiologists, we have our neurologists, we have our biomechanists, so on and so forth. In reality, they all intertwine to create these things that we see and do. And there's many smarter people than me trying to figure these things out, from making robotics and prosthetics and so on and so forth that can act human-like or animal-like. But there are definitely many more components that have to go into it. And I for me, the really cutting edge is starting to not put people into boxes of what they research. Like, I'm a neurophysiologist, or I'm a psychologist, or I'm a biomechanist, and really just we're talking about movement in general. And all those things have to come into play. So for me, psychology, the fear of movement is going to highly influence how much force you want to direct within a task. And, but oftentimes from a biomechanist standpoint, we don't consider fear. We don't consider practice. We don't consider motor learning aspects. And that's why I've always kind of dabbled in all those areas. So.
Yeah, now I'm curious about how they become law.
We'll figure it out.
No, I found out that he presented the laws in 1687. He presented his work at the Principia Mathematica Philosophical Naturalis. That's where he was accepted. So he
Okay.
presented those in a conference or something like that as laws for physics and mathematics.
Okay, so we'll have to take our time machine back into the 1600s and go attend that meeting, see what happened. Which most
Yeah,
likely was his ideas with a whole bunch of graduate students that we didn't call graduate students back then. And I'm pretty sure he didn't do it on a Zoom call. So.
yeah, he didn't. I'm pretty sure he had an apple in his hand, and she was like, "It's falling. Can you see? This has to be a law, right?"
I'm sure he probably hated apples, most likely. All right, so Dominic, you have a question on red flags in sports tasks. Are they for injury, fatigue, or aging? For me, so red flags are for anything that you are defining as a red flag. So it's an outlier. It's a system to think about what other actions can be there. So if you're injury risk, if you're training and fatigued, if you're aging, those are three things on those parts. I would just say they're all demarcation lines for checking of a change in a system, or the potential for the change in a system, or the risk potential for a change in a system. So that's kind of my definition of the red flag part, if that helps you.
Hey, final questions, last chance. Look at that. Once, twice, no. Dr. Renati, do you have any final consideration, anything you want to say before we close?
No, I appreciate everybody being on. I hope, these ideas of these very basic laws, basic components of human movement, not only components of human movement, but we need to, as clinicians, as leaders, as movement specialists, as rehabilitation experts, always consider our most fundamental rules prior to moving into these very advanced areas. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you. Before we go, I just want to tell everyone, thank you so much for being here. And don't forget to take a look on our YouTube channel, because we will be posting this webinar entirely or part of it there. And we have next webinar schedule. So January 5th, we have Dr. Douglas Powell. He will be talking about influence of sport bra support on athletic performance and injury risk. And January 19th, we have your truly and only Dr. James Sonati with the part 3 of the Newton's Law with the third law in biomechanics. And thank you all. Thank you all for coming so much. And again, take a look on our YouTube channel and Twitter. Thank you all. Bye.